It's my honor and pleasure now to introduce the last paper today. That would be by Stellan Vinthagen and Chabot, two well-known figures in the study of nonviolence. Sean's book and articles on the Gandhian repertoire are well-known. Stellan's work also well-known on nonviolence, especially his founding of the Journal of Resistance Studies. So they will be presenting together, and you'll do it up here. Yep. So, okay. Thank you very much.
So no PowerPoint. We're going to try to do something a little different and perhaps also a little bit dangerous. Our paper we wrote in the form of 11 theses. So most of you should know that this is a half-serious reference to Marx's theses on Feuerbach. But our idea is really to rethink the concept of nonviolent resistance, and then also to think of different ways of doing research. Obviously, with 11 theses, we can't really cover them adequately here within 20 minutes or perhaps even less. And so we really hope that you will read our piece and respond to it. So one reason we wrote it in theses is that it's easy to get our gist. We're punchy, provocative, perhaps not always totally extensive in our examples, but hopefully it'll lead to some constructive critique. So basically our starting point is that our fields, the field of nonviolent resistance studies and then also social movement studies, that they differ in some ways, and Kurt has, among others, has shown, some of these differences, but that they actually share a common paradigm, so a common way of seeing the world, and especially the world of contentious politics. So just the three of the basic assumptions that we see in the paradigm is that when we think of resistance and struggles, we always see two distinct and for the most part united parties, right? And obviously both of those parties, as Neil sort of pointed out, are partly looking for support, looking for favorable public opinion from mainstream society. But because we look at those two parties primarily, we pay perhaps less attention to the complexities of nonviolence, and especially to the nonviolent subjects who are actually participating in movements. Another thing that we do, besides looking at those two parties, is we tend to look at the contention between challengers and authorities. And so what this does is that when we look at nonviolent and other forms of protest, we tend to focus on how they either remove the states or regimes, especially in authoritarian states, or reform the states within liberal democracies. And both of these states, as I think also Kurt showed, are really for the most part serving capital. Final basic assumption that we see as part of this paradigm is that when we think about emancipation, which at the end of the day is of course what it's all about, we primarily focus on regime change, especially in authoritarian societies, and also on improving liberal democracies kind of within the way that the system works. So really we see a paradox here that to gain success for nonviolent resistance, we actually depend in many ways on a very violent state. And so based on a monopoly of violence. And so I think those are the three aspects of this paradigm. I mean, so one way to kind of sum that up, and I think several people have referred to this phrase, is that people see nonviolent resistance really as normal politics by other means. So research generally tends to analyze the causes of successes and failures in this area. So our point is not to say that this paradigm is bad. Obviously, this paradigm has been very productive. I think the conference here proves a lot of how productive that has been. We've ourselves, used this paradigm, but we feel that it's primarily productive from an academic perspective, but in other ways, it can also be quite limited. So for that reason, we kind of want to talk here as what you could think of as paradigm warriors. But we hope that you see the warriors, and I hope you see a little bit of the irony of using warriors at this conference. We want to see it in a more positive way, right? So it's not just to destroy or replace the paradigm, but to really question some of the certainties, right? Some of the truths that we kind of take for granted in the fields, point to some of its limits, and then open up also new possibilities. So really that's why our 11 theses you could kind of see as pointing towards an other politics by other means. So not a normal politics by other means, but other politics by other means. In thinking about this, we've been particularly inspired by the Zapatistas, right? And not just as a case study, but really as an example of a struggle of people, of communities engaging in another kind of nonviolent politics. So there's an irony here because in our fields, usually there's fairly little attention paid to the Zapatista movement. So especially in the nonviolent resistance field, I think most people see Zapatistas carrying rifles, and when we see that, we tend to say, oh, so this is not a nonviolent movement, and so we don't pay much attention in that field. Social movement studies, I think, paid a little bit more attention to the Zapatistas, but especially in the last, perhaps, decade, it seems like, from that perspective, it seems like the movement has been in decline. And so another point is that we don't only see the Zapatistas as a whole movement, but it's a good opportunity for us to look at very particular subaltern lives that they lead, right? So again, to shift a little bit more towards the subaltern aspects of struggle. As we'll show in a minute, we see the Zapatistas as practicing revolutionary nonviolent strategies in three particular areas and aspects. So on the first hand, instead of the politics of demand, which we see as the norm in both of our fields, they try to reinvent a kind of politics of dignity. Secondly, instead of the state-centered approach that prevails in our fields, they focus more on an autonomy-oriented approach to struggle. And also, they basically argue that their struggles not only against the state and not only against mainstream society, but also takes place in the form of what you could think of as internal counterconduct within the movement, right? And so before we go into that, I'll let Stellan talk a little bit more about the context.
Right. So this is part of a larger project we have. So we have been working on trying to find ways of understanding this kind of paradigm that we live with within civil resistance and social movement studies as at least partly an expression of a colonizing approach, where we have a system imposition on the life worlds then by a liberal paradigm, a liberal understanding of politics. And that's the reason why we then previously published in Mobilization on how to decolonize civil resistance. And also a book that I made 2 years ago around a theory of nonviolent action is part of that project, as well as the Journal of Resistance Studies. So if we would understand our field as being influenced by a discourse that is regulating according to colonial perspectives, then it becomes tremendously important to think around what kind of theories and concepts we are using as frames, what kind of practices we regard as being resistance, and also the ways that we are doing research.
Okay, so the first aspect, and also this is part of the decolonizing aspect, is this idea of politics of dignity, right? So I think all of us are very familiar with the politics of demand. So this is basically, to put it really in short terms, to pressure the state, both politically and also culturally. It tends to be, again, state-centered, so it focuses really on legal reforms and on some form of regime change. And so we're not denying, again, that these are not effective, or we're not denying that they often are effective, right? But we argue that they often also imply kind of short-term success for some groups but not necessarily, and actually often not, for subaltern people and for subaltern groups who often have to be represented, right? Even within the movements, they're often the represented ones. So again, the Zapatistas initially, when they first rose up in 1994, they basically tried armed struggle, right? That was their first sort of attempt at a form of politics of demand, right? And so they basically did this to go against the local governments in Chiapas and also to struggle for land, so also to occupy the land and so that they could, lead their own ways of life. After a few years of that, they actually tried an unarmed approach, so a nonviolent approach. They called that the strategy of the word, right? So they engaged in a lot of dialogue with the states, but also with civil society in Mexico and beyond. They also engaged in many of the demonstrations that we're all very familiar with. From their perspective, both of these strategies, so both the nonviolent and the violent strategies, had a limited effect on the total violence experienced by the indigenous people in Chiapas, right? In the Zapatista communities and then also outside of them. And so in many ways, they might have had some successes within government, but in terms of their well-being, not much had changed. So the Zapatistas decided around 2004, they decided to really fully commit to what they called the politics of dignity. And so for them, what this means is a little different than what we tend to think of as dignity, right? From a liberal perspective, we think of it more as something that's maybe inherently human, inherent to us as individuals, and also a basic universal human right. So for Zapatistas, dignity refers to something more specific. It refers to them refusing to submit, right? Refusing to submit to the situation, but also to their own reaction or previous responses to that situation, and also to take responsibility for their own capacities, for their own social relationships, and also for their own ways of life. So for them, this is a big shift, right? From politics of demand to politics of dignity. So on the one hand, and this is where the language in our paper becomes a little awkward, but we basically argue that what they're doing is not only against, and to a large extent, especially after the first 12 days of 1994, without violence, but in many ways they're actually focusing much more on beyond violence, right? Trying to create ways of life beyond violence. And one of the points that we really want to make is to think more deeply and broadly about nonviolence. We have to include all those: without, against, violence, and then also beyond violence. And one important aspect of this politics of dignity is that they don't propose or try to wage one great nonviolent or other kind of a struggle, but to engage in many struggles in, against, and beyond sort of the violent system that they're living in, right? So sometimes this might mean mass campaigns, but more often it means these kinds of struggles in everyday lives and local communities. So really what they're trying to do with this politics of dignity is to engage in what they see as an autonomy-oriented struggle.
Right, and even though the fire is still there, the army exists, they are not using it anymore. And although the word is still present, particularly in the dialogues with the national and the international civil society, the emphasis has then been shifted over to autonomy. And we see that as a fundamentally different orientation to the state orientation we find within our own academic field when we are looking at resistance or movements and protests. But the autonomy that they are talking about among the Zapatistas is not an autonomy that is about isolation. It's quite the opposite. They have been actively engaging in negotiation over several years with the state. But it's when that did not work, it's when that was denied, leading to any kind of indigenous rights, that they then turn towards autonomy. And they have been organizing really many repeated encuentros even what they have been famously calling intergalactic meetings, which is really, you could say, integrating a lot of different forces in the world, trying to have dialogues with them. So it's not in isolation. And it's not an individual approach to autonomy, rather a collective one, a community-based, land-based, and building on the indigenous traditions that they have. And also renew. And also, I think, importantly, it's not a matter of having a completed, finished autonomy. It's rather a matter of trying to develop something in a process that is emerging and accepted to be partial. Because there is a recognition we find among the Zapatistas that we are all entangled and embedded within the state and the market, if we want that or not, that's the situation. But we are that to degrees. It's not the same for every group of people. And particularly for subaltern groups, people like the indigenous in Chiapas, the dependency on the state as it looks historically and now has been deadly. And when you are in such a situation, then perhaps the relationship to the state is not valued in the same sense. So what is instead the project, I think, we should understand and recognize when it comes to the Zapatistas' approach to autonomy is rather to reconstitute the relationship in their project of trying to create a new form of constitution for Mexico as a national state, where they have collected marginalized groups, other subaltern groups throughout the country, in trying to create a new constitution. That is the constitution on the paper, but what they are trying to do through the autonomy project is to create a new constitution on the ground in their way of organizing and possibilities of having a relationship to the state. Formulated by a Zapatista major, Moises, I quote, "The villages realized that the government never asked the people what they wanted. The government does not want to address the needs of the villages. It only wants to maintain itself. And from there, the idea was born that we have to be autonomous, that we have to impose our will, that we should be respected, and that we have to do something so that what the people want will be taken into account." So this form of autonomy project is something about minimizing the subordination to the state, not abolishing it. It's about maximizing the communal capacities for independence within local municipalities and the interdependence among these units. And we are understanding this autonomy as having three aspects: a material one, a political one, and a social one. So the material one is very much about the land. Land occupations were central in the beginning of the Zapatista work from 1994 and onwards to create collective subsistence farming and various cooperatives, and drawing on the indigenous traditions and current ecological methods, having cooperatives that produce a number of different goods, like handicrafts, clothing, bread, and coffee, but through these cooperatives also providing the training opportunities for both youth and adults to learn how to self-govern. And then secondly, the political autonomy is about learning to organize and govern themselves in an approach, you could say, about government from below. They have created regional councils that are called Good Government Council, and you can guess who is the bad government. They have their political culture organized very much around the concept of mandar obedeciendo. Sorry for my lack of Spanish. But it means lead by obeying, which means that the leaders are obeying the people, which is a very fundamentally different approach to what leadership and political authority means. They also have rotating positions in their different councils. Furthermore, the social autonomy is key in creating services they never got from the Mexican state. So, particularly in areas of health and education, they have been training hundreds of doctors and health promoters and created hundreds of new schools and educational promoters. They even have an autonomous university.
Okay, I know time is running out, but I want to just quickly point to one very specific internal form of struggle for autonomy, especially by the Zapatista women, right? And I don't want to get too much into the concept of counterconduct, but the basic idea is for Michel Foucault, who invented this or created this concept. His idea is to rethink power and to see it as a form of government, and government he translates as basically the conduct of conduct, right? So I know, and basically in the word conduct, it has multiple meanings. So on the one hand, conduct can be kind of like a conductor where you conduct somebody. So somebody is, you're being conducted. But at the same time, conduct also means like your behavior. So you can also basically be in charge of your own conduct. So the idea of government is always a tension between the two. And the counterconduct doesn't say that there's no need for government, right? Government of the self or government of society, but it just says, well, we're governed in a certain way, but we can always govern a little bit differently. We don't want to be governed like that, and perhaps we don't want to be governed quite so much, right? And so then that's where the idea of creating your own forms of government come from. And so the Zapatista women have been very fundamental within the Zapatista struggle, right? Subcomandante Marcos talks about their struggle as the revolution within the revolution. And one of the main things that they're trying to do is fight, the violence that they suffer within their communities, within their homes, even within the movement, right? So they face all kinds of violence, whether it's forced marriage, forced childbirth and very high childbirth with lots of high infant death rates, rape, abuse, death, and especially also, or part of this is also a lack of self-rule, right? A lack of deciding what you can do with your own life. So one of the main things they did is to actually create what they call the Revolutionary Women's Law. And this actually occurred before 1994, before they sort of became well known. I know time is running out, but I want to have just one Zapatista, her name is Captain Isabel, explain about how this law came about. And I think it says a lot about this idea of counterconduct and also what autonomy-oriented struggles can look like, especially within a movement and in everyday life. So she says, we gave women space to talk, to express their feelings and how they wanted to change all this. Life in the family, with their husband, with their children, that was where the ideas came from. If things are this bad, we asked ourselves, why not change it? Change men's ideas as well, and find a way as an organization to turn these ideas into law. And that's how the Women's Revolutionary Law was born. Talking, venting, analyzing. It's not something from outside. It came from our own ideas, our own experiences. So this is really for us a great expression of autonomy-oriented struggles, where it's really about learning to conduct yourself as an individual, in relationship with each other, and then also as a community. And of course, as Stellan already mentioned, this is always an ongoing and definitely also a flawed struggle. So they're not claiming that they've already achieved autonomy. It's always oriented in that direction. And so by doing this, they basically create kind of a counter society within the wider social movement. And so the women engage in their own leadership within organizations like the EZLN and other organizations, create their own co-ops, and also hold their own encuentros. So this happens within the wider movement. It's not against the wider movement, but it's to try to go beyond that.
Right, so we will finish here, but I just want to say that if we then accept and see that there is a colonial imprint in our studies, and we also see that there is value to the decolonial project, as with, for example, the Zapatistas, we think that this has profound consequences for our field and how we approach social movements and resistance and the way we do research. But that kind of thoughts of what kind of consequences that has, that we put in the paper, so you can see that. Thank you.